everybody here. And I'm delighted that we've been joined by Nathan Oswin, who is the founder of Labour Society of Campaigners and is a trade union campaigner, and by David Barker, who is a charity director from the West Midlands and is a former employee of the Liam Byrne for West Midlands Mayor campaign, and by Charlotte Butterick, who has got a stellar prior career in the Labour Party world. Used to work for Labour Party MEPs in the glory days when we had MEPs. We will again. So look forward to that. We just don't know when. And she's since then worked on the Care for Leader campaign, and then more recently has been working with Tracy Brabin to try and get Tracy Brabin elected as the first West Yorkshire Mayor, which we hope will happen in a few weeks' time. So the subject for today's webinar is the May elections, particularly looking at the mayoral elections rather than thinking about Scotland, Wales, locals, etc. So be good to talk about metro mayors and other mayors as well. I mean, also thinking about people like Marvin Rees and Labour's, I guess, how Labour has done in those elections to this point, and then also how we're likely to perform in this coming election. Talk about Labour's offer, what's the offer of these mayors and of the Labour Party generally in these May elections, and then to talk about, I guess, a little bit about how we expect these elections to go, even though, of course, it's difficult to say in the context of coronavirus and, all the uncertainties around that. And then also what we think Labour needs to do over the next couple of months to maximise turnout and to maximise the Labour vote and our success. Because as we all know, this is important. These elections are important in and of themselves because we want Labour representation, but also because we need to be winning things now if we want to look like a party that is in recovery and a government in waiting. So on that note, I will hand over to Nathan. Are you okay to go first?
Yeah, sure, not a problem.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Although I always get a little nervy at the start of these things when people start talking about their books in their background, and I kind of look behind and it's just shelves of spirits, which probably tells you more about how I'm getting through lockdown alongside with the society than anything else. But hey ho, there we go. So yeah, my name's Nathan. I'm one of the founders with the Labour Society of Campaigners. We were established, which is a very formal way of saying we kind of managed to pull things together and launch in December last year with the aim to try and spread best practice around campaigning techniques across the party and innovate and test to see what actually works. And the mayoral elections for us is just a great opportunity to do some on-scale testing. As you'll all know, one of the big things about Devo mayors, at least, or however they're termed. Remember when they came in, we all called them Devo mayors. Remember when Andy Burnham first came in, and the language has changed somewhat since. But they're absolutely huge. I think Mary, it sounded like, was in Liverpool. So just to give an idea of scale, as Mary will know, you've got kind of three key sets of elections up in Liverpool. You've got the local authority, the police crime commissioner, and then the Devo mayor, plus then the mayoral lead of the council authority. And each of those footprints gets massively confused. So you have the local authority boundary for Liverpool, then the police crime commissioner boundary stretches out further beyond that, and then Steve Rotherham's boundary stretches out even further beyond that. So it has another district authority, I think it is, that's on top of the police crime commissioner ones. Now, the advantage from a testing perspective with that is, of course, you have this real holistic top-down view where you can spot trends and data that's coming in various bits, potentially map that up against mosaic and other demographics to give you real insight as to what's actually happening on the ground. Normally you would, but of course, in the age of COVID, getting that voter ID back in is far more challenging, whereas traditionally we'd all be out banging on doors and trying to have persuasive conversations or voter ID conversations with people. We've now moved on to dialogue. And I don't know if many of you have had the chance to get on dialogue. For those of you that have, you'll recognise those three questions with a score of 1 to 10 on them that says, how's Labour doing? How do you think the government's doing in the pandemic? How do you think the government's handling and protecting jobs? And third, how do you view Keir Starmer as Labour leader? And that's all because the dialogue is framed through marketing legislation. So we can't have the same conversations on dialogue that you're actually allowed on the doorsteps. So those conversations where you'd normally bang on the door and somebody say, you know what, I'm not really sure, I don't really get it. What's the difference between a civic mayor, a devolved mayor, and a mayor that's leader of the authorities? And you could have a good persuasive chat about the importance of casting your vote. Technically, you're not meant to do that through dialogue because it's meant for market research, and that's the legislation that covers it. And then, so that's one interesting conundrum we've got with this election coming up. How do we replace that traditional voter identification and persuasion mechanisms? Now, for me, there is just such a key role for those Devo mayors within this, because they have that advantage strategically, at least, of it's kind of a presidential election. A lot of people are voting on the personalities involved. Do they feel competent? Do you think they get what your community is about? Would they make a difference proactively on the priorities that matter to you? There's actually relative interest, I would suggest, in terms of social media engagement there. And I think the days when we were wondering whether Facebook was a useful platform for campaigning have long gone. It's now just an essential key tool within campaigns. And there's a real advantage to having that mayoral model involved in that strategically. You can pass messages, join up little community groups together and bring them together to form, effectively digital communities and help really find out what's going on in communities and what their importance is. So that's enough on the kind of boring strategic end. The important bit, I suppose, we all want to know is, are we going to win? Which is, I know, is one of the bits that might kind of flagged. I mean, the first thing to note on this is, if we want to have any chance in 2024, we absolutely have to. West Midlands so I'm an East Midlander, so we've not got a devolved mayor, but just over the road. A lot of those seats on our target to 326 next time are ones that were traditional red wallers. They were started to be called in 2019, or we used to just call, safe seats. And a large part of that collapse started in the West Midlands, West Bromwich East, West Bromwich West, the 2 seats in Stoke. There's a whole pile that runs through the West Midlands, curving up into the northwest, and again across into West Yorkshire, where I know, Tracy Brabin's our candidate. And ultimately, if we're not doing really, really well in those mayoral elections and showing a real big increase in our vote from where we were last time, there's very, very little chance in reality of us getting back into government next time around. The big threat, I think it's safe to say, is the vaccine programme that's currently coming through. As we all remember, at the start of COVID, the government very much benefited from a rally round the flag factor at the start of the pandemic, everybody pulling together. And now they're starting to benefit from the vaccines, and that light at the end of the tunnel is starting to push through and be seen. And that's a challenge. That's a real, real challenge for us to push through. And Labour's offer has got to be, for me, to get round that, really embedded in local communities. I'm a big believer that if ultimately I'm a 2-year-old, every time I walk in past the park and there's a broken swing, and I have to explain to it as best you can to a 2-year-old, you can't go on the swing, it's broken. I feel like a bad parent. But actually, and that stuff matters, fixing those local things that actually make a day-to-day detriment or impact on my life can start to bring that politics is local mechanism back into play. And at the minute, politics doesn't feel local. It feels national. It feels that it's national issues that are being determined on. Mike, I think that's me done for rattling on. I could go on about this for another 45 minutes, but I don't feel that's fair to anybody, let alone to David and Charlotte. So I hope I've not covered too much in that intro.
No, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Nathan. If people have questions for Nathan or anybody else, please, as usual, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can ask them verbally once we've heard from the other speakers. So, Charlotte, can we come to you? now, and be great to hear from you and get the perspective from, well, from your experience first and foremost, and then also from West Yorkshire as well.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. And yeah, before I completely agree with you, Nathan. I mean, all my stash of spirits is below the code, and this is all fake books, so don't worry. It's no true representation. So yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you said actually, and it's really interesting hearing all. Mike and I spoke about this last week about different experiences across the country, and totally agree on the kind of things are just being run on a massive national basis at the minute, and I'm not sure if that is really going to be, you know, the especially here in West Yorkshire, where, you know, this will be a real first test of the red wall, and I don't think, yeah, I think that we really have to be, if, you know, comms alone things isn't going to cut it, we really have to be organising better. So I think here, I mean, the things that kind of struck, that have kind of struck here, basically throughout the, yeah, we've tried to kind of, to like, as we've gone from Tracy's selection campaign now into the actual election campaign, it's picking up different pace of campaigning and things. So because this is like a very new election as well, there's no precedent, it is seen as an incumbent election for Labour winning it. So it's that presents its own challenges, but when you compare it with the 2019 general election results, then with local election results, because in essence it's a local, there's lots of different local elections, so the result will be kind of similar to what we see in local elections, but with the kind of caveat of what happened in the 2019 general election. There's a lot of challenges, so we think there's around about a 6 to 7% ish gap between Labour and Tories overall for the whole of West Yorkshire going Labour or Tory, and you know, there's a lot of different things that come into play with that, what happens to the Brexit Party vote, things like that. So how does the messaging of what the party is saying and the candidate is saying is actually going to be really important, as well as picking up a lot of Green and Lib Dem votes, which that it does, when you look at it on paper like that, things look pretty tight. So yeah, we're looking at ways of GOTV that, because there's also a certain concern that turnout in Tory constituencies in West Yorkshire are higher than in Labour constituencies, so that could present a lot of problems. How do we best get out the vote for us in a number of Labour held seats, which are kind of where turnout is maybe below the national average? So there's a bit of, yeah, there's a bit of how do we get maximum GOTV effort within the circumstances? It's already difficult. So I think, yeah, looking at, and we've had a really effective phone banking operation here in West Yorkshire that we kind of started in Tracy's selection campaign. That was brilliant. We managed to contact 18,000 members in 6 weeks. And I don't know if any of you used the Call for Keir on Keir's leadership campaign. We had the Call for Keir app, which was where it was a really simple tool. And we used that, we replicated that again on Tracy's campaign. And that, I mean, it's different in mayoral elections, because I think with dialogue, you can only, it's a marketing, and Nathan, you might know a bit more about this, it's you can only do it for digital marketing purposes, so you can't actually canvass. So I think that is presenting a real problem in the types of kind of campaigning that you can do virtually. So that's why you get the kind of scaled questions on dialogue. So yeah, it's looking like it's probably going to be an uncomplicated kind of get out the vote operation in Labour areas. For us, it's like Leeds, Bradford, for areas where we know where the highest votes are. But yeah, we're just looking at different ways to kind of to try and to just have maximum turnout as possible, which, you know, in the circumstances is pretty, and because there's no kind of precedent, it's a particular challenge. So I'm just checking to see. Yeah, so I guess tapping into and as well, the real concern is because the Tories haven't even got a candidate here for West Yorkshire yet, we don't think. What kind of campaign will they run? And obviously, as we get nearer and nearer to May, I think the interesting thing is, just bearing in mind with the general election result, what kind of campaign might they try and aim for, or what kind of votes will they try and pick up? What kind of candidate would they put there? Is this going to be their priority, or will it be another by-election? So yeah, there's a lot of just ways of organising differently around this election. I think that no one can shy away from it. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. The Tories, I think, and I might be wrong on this, but I think that they can actually do some online canvassing on their phone bank. I think they use a system called VoteSource. So I don't really know much about that, and I don't know if anybody is looking into that kind of thing as to whether what that allows them to be able to do. But yeah, I think there's the organising must really reflect the kind of circumstances that we're in, and use the, we've got so many, we can't do certain other things, but how are we going to best get our messages across to people in West Yorkshire and get out to reach more people as well? So yeah, I think I'll stop there. I could go on and on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlotte. That was great, as always. And then last but not least, we'll come to you, David, to talk about your view generally on the elections and how you think they're going, and then also the West Midlands, Liam's campaign, and how that's looking right now.
Brilliant. I do have to head off at past, so sorry if I suddenly disappear. But so I ran Liam Byrne's campaign for his selection, and then worked on the election campaign. I also worked with Simon Foster, who's our Police and Crime Commissioner candidate, and the two elections are the exact same geography, which makes it quite simple. So a year ago, Corbyn's office, back when he was leader, they said to us that they felt the West Midlands mayoral election was the most important election in the country because it's the closest of the mayorals, it's the biggest outside of London. We lost by less than 1% in 2017, when the media expected us to win. So winning it from the Tories could have really potentially been a big story for us, mainly to distract from the fact that we were expecting big losses across the country. I was told in the hundreds of councillors. We actually selected quite late. It was the 6th of February when we had a candidate, which gave us 3 months for an election. And in terms of West Midlands, for those who don't know, the current mayor is the Conservative Andy Street, and he's incredibly popular. He's incredibly good as a campaigner. So going up against a popular, well-known campaigner with high recognition was always going to be a challenge. And in Liam Byrne, we had someone who had quite high national recognition, but maybe not the same level at the regional scale. So it's always going to be difficult. And you might think that having a year's delay would have addressed this, in the plenty of time to sort of get the campaign out. But mostly due to COVID, everything's been at a standstill. There's been no in-person campaigning. I don't think there's been a single leaflet gone out to the entire authority from the candidates, from Labour anyway, which has made it very difficult. There's been a big push for dialogue here, although my understanding is take-up hasn't been nearly high enough to offset the lack of doorstep canvassing, which is generally, quite good in a lot of areas here. So there's a bit of a feeling that we've kind of sat still since the election was delayed, and we weren't able to get anything out before the election was delayed either. And it also feels, although we are still at its mercy, because it could be delayed again. The feeling's a bit odd that council workers feel that it can and should be, because purely on the data we've got, we're expecting all over 18s to have had their first jab by June, July. So if you delay it until September, you don't have to really think about the logistics of how you run an election in COVID quite to the same scale you would now. My feeling is the government will push ahead with May, despite how damaging this will be, because they'll probably get a nice boost from the vaccine rollout being at its peak at that time. I think the only thing that could delay it then would be if there is a new problem like another COVID variant, or issues with vaccines, or perhaps if councils on the ground say, we physically can't manage this, it's just not going to happen. At the moment, it feels like it's on a knife edge. I would say that, I mean, in 2019, the Labour-Tory vote was almost 50-50 split in the constituencies here. The polls are better for us now than they were then, but Andy Street will outperform the Conservative vote. There's also, a fear for the Tories will bounce again when we get closer. A lot of it really feels like it will depend on Starmer more than anything locally, that it's really about the core Labour vote and the message to kind of get people out generally, rather than local councillors and local sort of candidates for mayor. People will, as a result, see these elections as a virtue Starmer. They should, because it will be his first big test. Normally, I think with a leader, we probably would have had elections by now, but they keep getting delayed. And I think once you've had, I know there's some concerns about Starmer at the moment, but I think it's just from heavily politicized people who are used to having seen one election happen. So we'll know whether or not he can rise to the occasion just by having some election. The elections we're running off the back of 3-4 years ago were a bit of a mixed bag. So while the party's trying to maintain expectations, I would say a bad night is staying where we are. Anything less than keeping what we have and gaining at least one other mayor would be a bad night. I would say a good night would be gaining West Midlands and West Yorkshire and maybe one of the Tees Valley or West of England ones. A great night would be getting all of them, but the politics is all quite different in all the areas. It feels here that if we can get the election delayed, we've got a better chance of Starmer maybe getting a better narrative across. Part of it is actually he could demand that we delay the election. It could be something he could use to attack the government's carelessness. I feel personally it would help if we had TV debates with him able to sort of get his face out there to the public in a much bigger way, purely because COVID has completely taken up everybody's headspace, that not everyone is even aware of who our leader is. And really local candidates, as good as they are, can't do either thing. And the feeling in the West Midlands is Liam Byrne's doing a good job with his social media, but it's not enough to win the election. Ultimately, we will need something bigger coming. And if the election isn't delayed, I would worry that the Tories will win with a small majority. Unless something else happens, that feels like we're heading towards Street edging it. And again, he got by less than 1% last time, but him doing that again is the feeling now. And I'll stop there in case I suddenly have to disappear.
There we go, Mahmoud. Brilliant, thank you, David. That was fascinating. And just stay as long as you can, and thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it, because I know you've got to rush off and do something else important. So a couple of questions from me, and then we will open up to questions from everybody else. So first question from me, I don't mind which one of you wants to take it. Labour's national message. What is it in the run-up to the May elections? Like, why are we saying to people they should come out and vote for the Labour Party? And if you aren't happy with what it is, what do you think that it should be? Nathan, do you want to take that?
I was just blowing hard thinking, oh, that's the question no one wants, isn't it? But yeah, so thanks for that. I mean, what the message is, I suspect at the minute, is there's an attempt to just show a divide between us and the government on a few key issues. So I know we were talking before the call around the kind of, the teachers vaccinating first, the Marcus Rashford and feeding of school children between as well is another good example. It feels like there are several kind of issues that are being framed as a here's the difference in a value set between us and the government, and that's the difference. I think in the background, I suspect, and I don't know, it's not like, you know, I have these chats at a super high level or anything like that, but I suspect there is a nervousness about trying to run too far ahead. I think partly because there was quite a lot of thoughts after 19 about the amount of offer that was contained and the pace of change. So there's a few little bits to try and cause separation. But I think mainly the approach was for the past year has been the government is handling the pandemic badly. Let's just, you know, hold them to account and try and pressurise them, but that will deal with the politics of the situation. Now, of course, the vaccine has come and changed it all. I think that unless, yeah, I think there's one issue I think you can really push on, two issues probably nationally for a national framing of the message. One is about competence. You know, we're coming up to years of anniversaries of people dying through COVID, and importantly, the late lockdown that happened in March. So there's a competence issue that you can frame about the Conservatives running things. And then secondly, is around that the values bit, you know, and the clear obvious one for that is the kind of Dominic Cummings example. You know, it's all right, they're sticking up for the mates, this is what we expect from a Conservative administration. And there's been a bit of that. You've seen some chatter on Twitter from figures about, you know, Priti Patel not being sacked for bullying is another bit of that framing around they're standing up for their mates again. Gavin Williamson somehow still having a job, and I don't even necessarily mean as education minister. I mean, I just think it's a miracle that guy is employed, let alone anything else. But again, that's being framed through this, they're sticking up for their mates. I think what Labour does better than the Tories any time is when we're actually framing stuff through local campaigns. The Tory comm strategy now is they leave it late, which is why I don't think they're that hassled about selecting a candidate in West Yorkshire. They'll let the national message do the talking. They'll carpet bomb with leaflets sent through direct mails. That's always been their campaign strategy. That's their tradition. Whereas for us, it's a different thing. So I say for me, heavy focus on local messaging, relayed across press, digital, and through direct mail. And then a few separation from the national party, I think, is the way that we should go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Charlotte, David, did either of you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I would just agree with a lot of that. We've been using kind of digital mapping techniques to try and find out really, because that's really where you get the, you know, it's all right having all this data and information about what you know about people, but it's how you use that to inform your strategy and inform your messaging and communication. So through different methods, I mean, there's various different avenues that you can collect and use this kind of social listening or just basic data, anecdotal collection. We've been trying to say, like, right, well, we know that council tax rises here are big issues in Dewsbury, for example, or so, and this is people are saying a lot about this thing here, and kind of trying to map there where we think where and what we think the biggest things are, and kind of bring together to, I guess, build up a portfolio of the like the best local messaging that works on top of the national narrative. And obviously, like, the national narrative, I think, in answer to your question, Mike, would be on, you know, competent, not speaking on behalf of the Labour Party, but the incompetence of the government, and, you know, the pre-vaccination kind of rollout on to get Britain vaccinated. So yeah, I think it's, and you have, I guess, in like this kind of campaign world, we're in this split between, you've got the day-to-day political people who, you know, are aware and follow every policy development and every issue, probably like a lot of us, that read things and are up to date in general. And then you have, you know, I guess a lot of people that just generally follow the national narratives of things and kind of pick up on in and out of policies and messaging here and there. So it's about, I think getting a balance between the two, so not pandering to every single twist and turn that is going on in the national picture, but to kind of just but then at the same time not just thinking that, oh, it's fine because people won't pick up on that, or that like things, it's the surprising things like that stick sometimes, that you can't predict, or that you can't have that kind of policy that kind of messaging control over. So yeah, I just think really, really good local messaging really matters, and you can kind of, when you've mastered that, you can really integrate the Labour values thing into that and say why voting for Labour will make a difference in your local area. I think ultimately, and with Tracy's campaign, we've kind of, we've because on top of that, the mayor in West Yorkshire is probably different in other areas, but there's only certain remits that the mayoral control capacity, so we don't want to like go and talk about things that the mayor won't be able to have any control over, so it's about implicating that as well. And yeah, we've tried to do a really comprehensive manifesto, build on the manifesto that Tracy put forward in a selection campaign, and then kind of flesh that out, having roundtables, things like that, to really try and make it as comprehensive as possible. So I think that answers it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. David, is David still here? No, he's not. So I won't ask David for a contribution. Okay, Mary, let's come to you for a question. Go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to give you a little bit of a picture from Merseyside. We're a little bit different to most of the other mayoral authorities in that we've got two right bang next to one another. Living in Merseyside, we've got Steve Rotherham as our metro mayor, or our regional city region mayor. But at the top of our road, we've got living none other than Andy Burnham, because across the road from me is Greater Manchester. And so we've kind of got the two of them that have been working brilliantly hand in hand in a lot of cases over COVID and trying to get better conditions for the North. But at the same time, Andy, having stepped in that little bit sooner and with a better organisation already in place, he outshines Steve, hands down, on so many points. He's always in the news. So if you were to say to people around here, name a regional mayor, even though we're in Merseyside, I wouldn't be surprised if quite a lot of the population would say Andy Burnham rather than Steve Rotherham, and they don't actually, they wouldn't be covered by that person for their vote. Anyway, I am actually organising hustings. I did it last year, which of course fell through, but I have got the hustings started now for this time for the regional city regional mayor, the city mayor, and the PCC. And I can tell you that the Lib Dems are up and running. They picked who they're going to have as candidates. Labour have, apart from the city mayor, but because of Joe Anderson and the scandal surrounding him, he's stepped down, and we've got three ladies councillors who are standing to replace him. So we should hear by sometime beginning of March who's going to stand for city mayor. So we've got that going on. So like I say, it's all a bit higgledy-piggledy. I can understand where they're coming from when they talk about what's going on in the Midlands with somebody who's charismatic because of having Andy down the road here. And the question I was going to ask has gone completely out of my head in the meantime because I've rabbited on so much. I'm sorry, Mike. I know from the point of view of canvas, of going out there, and what's covered by Manchester and what Manchester Mayor can do and what Liverpool region can do is completely different. Steve doesn't have the same coverage as Andy over certain aspects and topics. So there is this discrepancy. It is a very higgledy-piggledy organisation of devolution. I've never, you wouldn't make it up. So, you know, at that point, I will just shut up and leave you to it, because I will eventually think of what my question was. But that was my 2 pence.
No, that was great, Mary. And I think you're right. I think our system of devolution is it is incomplete, and it clearly wasn't thought through in the beginning. Which kind of brings me on to my next question, really. And Mary, feel free to contribute, but Nathan, Charlotte, and others as well. Which is that I just wonder how much the public actually understands the powers that the mayors have, and therefore, do they have any clue when they're thinking about, well, how do I hold my existing mayor to account? You know, on what yardstick, by what yardstick am I measuring their success or failure? And also, what am I thinking about when I'm thinking about which mayor I'm going to vote for next time round? My guess is they'll be thinking about the national messaging rather than what their local mayor has achieved or not achieved. You know, with some obvious exceptions, and I think Andy would probably be the key obvious exception, because he's I mean, he was a national politician anyway, but he's clearly been seen to, you know, stand up very publicly for the people of Greater Manchester, which is his job, you know, during the pandemic. And I think Marvin Rees, you know, is another one who has, you know, his own profile, and perhaps less so nationally over COVID, but certainly has been very outspoken in the last few months and year over Black Lives Matter. And I think has done that, you know, exceptionally well. So Nathan, Charlotte, and anybody else, I mean, what are your thoughts on how over the next few weeks now, Labour mayors and we as the party can try and create some public awareness of these are your mayors and this is what they do and this is why you should be happy with them, or, you know, sad about them or angry with them if they are disappointed if they're Tory mayors. And what, I mean, I guess as well, Labour needs a pitch for the future. And I know we're going to have a convention at some point, but that's always a bit of a, you know, it's a bit of a damn squib in a way, isn't it? But we need some kind of line on our governance and our future, particularly in light of Brexit and the power grab that has resulted from that, from the centre and Westminster. That was a very long question.
May I ask a question later, Mike?
Yes, you can, absolutely. I'll come to you next, Philip.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, I'll just I totally agree with what you said, Mary, about the kind of Andy Burnham effect as what like during Tracy's campaign, the selection campaign, it was at the time when Andy just became known as then the King of the North, and honestly that had such a that had such a powerful effect on the whole rest of the campaign, because suddenly like mayors were like the hot topic and everyone knew what they were, and I think there's like a real power in that, of like actually that shows the power of the regions. And this is you know, in national politics is kind of frozen for a minute, like when we are all literally stuck in our own in our places, and we're all looking around at the people around us and the places that we live in, rather than just like focus on London and you know, power centralizing from there. I think this is a real moment that we can say, no, actually the regions really matter. You know, Andy's fight against the tiered systems and all of that, and how so I guess for us it was, yeah, developing that into a narrative where we could say to Labour members, well, you know, can you imagine having like a Labour voice for West Yorkshire and a female powerful Labour voice for West Yorkshire? How brilliant that would be, and how it would just kind of elevate you as a region across. And so it's interesting what you say about the comparison between the two areas, and I wonder why, like I bet there's a lot of different factors at play there, but I think a lot of it is about the quality of your interventions, you kind of your general organisation. I think you have to, if you've got a really tight ship in terms of how that your kind of thing is organised, your intervention, things are planned, things just go better. The general visibility is something that kind of comes with that. So it would be interesting to hear what you guys think about why that is exactly, and what you think maybe what lessons can you know, people take from Andy Burnham, because I think a bit of a Yorkshire versus Lancashire thing, that he can't be King of the North because that's Yorkshire, that's in Yorkshire.
Well, is
Yeah,
the king of the top of the road here. basically, he's got a very good communications team. His face is everywhere. It always has been. I mean, he used to be MP for Lee and Goulburn, which is at the top of the road here, falls into Lee. So it was known in the area anyway. But since he's taken over as mayor, he kind of slotted straight into a framework that was already there. I think was it Sir Richard Lees had already got the office up and running beforehand. So he slotted in, and the communications were there. So every time you open a newspaper, if there's something to be said, he's saying it. You don't get that with Steve. You'd have thought with a lippy scouser, you would have got it.
Yeah,
but you don't.
Whatever it is, opinion on it.
Yeah, not in the same way. And then the government tried to split them over the tier system, and they gave Liverpool the tests and the different things, but they didn't give them to Manchester. So they tried to split them, but the two mayors did come out and say, look, we may have got it, but that was because they offered it, so we grabbed it. But it's not going to split us. We think that Manchester should get the same.
And I think you're right, Mary, to refer to the teams that are around some of the different mayors. So I know Sadiq's team is very good, and he's always had a very capable team around him, and I think Andy has as well. And that may not be the case, but I'm sure it isn't the case for some of the others. And that is one of the things that a political leader needs to get right, because no human being can, however capable they are and however much star quality they've got, can do it all on their own, because running something of the magnitude of a country or a region or a mayoralty is too big an endeavor for one person to do on their own. And successful, I mean, this isn't just true here, it's true everywhere. Successful political leaders know that they are limited in terms of their skills, but also just the hours in a day, and they put really good teams of people around them. And other political leaders don't do that. Nathan, any thoughts from you?
I mean, only to add two quick bits. I mean, the one, Burnham's at his best when he's doing that individual profiling stuff. That is when he shines. And of course, he did have a profile in Liverpool because he was so involved in when he was back in the Home Office alongside the Hillsborough campaign. So he did have a profile established across Merseyside and Liverpool as well. That explains part of that. But he is just incredibly gifted at that presidential kind of style politics. That's, a mayoral role is almost perfectly suited to his style of politics and how he presents and comes forward. I mean, the other bit with that was really illustrated is, look, I have a golden rule of politics, which is, and I hope none of you take offence to this, but every single one of us on this call is a weirdo, because we're giving up a Monday evening to talk about politics. Now, if you go out into the real world, which I'm told is in Leeds from the remembering quotes, but if you go out into the real world, people could think of nothing worse than going onto a Zoom call on a Monday night to discuss mayoral elections or, frankly, any form of politics. Now, if we're struggling to understand what the difference is between all the mayors and what role Andy Burnham has and what role Steve Rotherham has, and then Tracy down to Dan, and then actually there's Peter Soulsby in Leicester, and what's he got compared to Marvin Rees in Bristol and Sadiq in London, how on earth would we ever expect somebody who thinks about politics occasionally, normally around election time and normally in a general election, because of course council elections and every other election turnout is far lower, how would we expect those people to engage? Because it is so convoluted and has been so badly implemented from the centre state out into devolved things. And I think that's the test. That's the real big challenge with mayorals, is how do you focus on explaining the role and why they're so important, when the strategic thing to do is to basically pretend like they don't exist and just focus on the national message, because nobody understands the local roles anyway. And, Charlotte, I'm sure, and every other team advising mayors will be having this constant clash against advisors within the party for which one works better. which is the right way to go. And that's always the tension.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one of the problems we have in Britain, actually, one of the many, many problems we have in Britain in our democracy, is that people, generally speaking, they're clearly dissatisfied with our democracy. You know, people, I mean, that was one of the drivers, one of the many, many drivers, of course, of the Brexit vote. And people obviously don't trust their politicians. They don't particularly like the government that we've got. They don't like the system of governance that we have. They feel far away from decision makers. They feel they can't influence decision makers. And yet, when you ask them, do you want another layer of governance, as in mayors or, you know, devolved or whatever, the people don't always say no, but quite often they say no in focus groups or polling, or when offered the chance of, you know, a new mayor or something like that, which is why in the end, George Oswin just imposed them on people. Because when there were referenda at a local level to say, do you want a mayor? Most regions, I think, voted no. So people don't want more politicians, I guess, because they don't really like politicians and they don't trust them. So they end up thinking, well, they don't want to pay for any more of them. But nevertheless, they feel far away from Westminster, just as they felt far away from Brussels. And they end up voting for, you know, things that are not necessarily in their interest, or just feeling frustrated. So I think one of the problems is the fact that people don't really know what mayors do, and they don't even particularly know what councils do either. So somebody, hopefully the next Labour government, would need to probably establish some kind of convention so that it's apolitical, but then propose a system of blanket devolved, you know, power sharing. And I think Labour is shifting in this direction under Starmer, actually, that will take power to a more local level in areas where that is appropriate, but then will also, I mean, obviously, in my view and our view, take power to supranational level within the EU where that is appropriate. Because that's where, you know, there are different, you know, layers where power is most appropriately held. And we need to make that argument to people, but it takes a long time. We haven't really begun making that argument yet. We are coming up on time. And Philip, I know you've got a question, so please go ahead.
Can I ask a question as well, please, Andrew Bryant?
Yes, of course. I'll let Philip go first, Andrew.
How long have we got,
Okay.
Mike?
6
5
minutes,
minutes?
Philip.
6 minutes?
Yes.
Well, what I wanted to say is we can't really address the issues of executive mayors or city region mayors without looking at the past. And the Norman times, we had the Council of the North, which covered the whole of the north of England. Now, people, in my experience, they don't know the difference between Lord Mayors, Mayors-elect, the mayors of London and the City of London, and the city region mayors. Take, for instance, in South Yorkshire, Dan's got the mayorship, but he's got limited powers. He's got transport, further education, and one or two other things that I can't recall. Then in West Yorkshire, whoever gets the mayorship will have the police commissioner's powers, I believe, and as well as transport. Now Andy Burnham's got 10 boroughs in his remit, including the city of Manchester. He's got enormous responsibilities and the powers. Now, what I'm trying to say is the government, this Conservative government, they've tossed an hand grenade into local government. It's a time bomb in local democracy and local government. And the public have had enough of it. What's the mayor for? What's the elected mayor for? What's the councillor for? They're given the responsibility without the means to raise money or implement policies. Now, if we're going to win these elections for the mayors, the police commissioners, councillors, MPs, we're going to have to tell the public exactly what each mayor's responsibilities are going to be, where the money's coming from, and where it fits in the local councils. And we're going to have to work together. Otherwise, we're going to lose. As I said, this Conservative government, who I detest and despise, they've, as I said earlier, they've tossed an hand grenade into local democracy. They're not right keen on the Scottish Parliament. They're not particularly keen on the Welsh Assembly. They're not keen on democracy, full stop. And we all know what they think about Europe, but it's the people we aim to represent that matter. They have to be convinced between now and May the 8th, is it?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Philip. Nathan, Charlotte, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think you've kind of perfectly described, Philip, why exactly, kind of if that can be articulated, that's exactly why people need to realize, like, getting to grips with that is why Labour mayors are essential. So like the politics aside, electing a Labour mayor is the most critical thing. You can argue about all the technicalities and things after we've won this election. And I think, yeah, with the government, there's always sort of like an imagery thing at play with what they're trying to do. And they're trying to, I just think with devolution, they're trying to make it as complicated and as difficult as possible, as we know, to try and like, so that their kind of their responsibility is the national picture doesn't change, but you know their responsibility for all the kind of local things just shreds off that. So yeah, I think just being very aware of what the politics at play are, that we don't erode the accountability of the government and the national government, but yeah, stick as kind of team Labour in as many parts as possible, and just make that case.
Great, thanks. Right, we're coming up on time, but we've got a couple more questions. I've got a written question from Vicky, which we'll come to in a second, but Andrew, let's get your verbal question first, please.
Thank you. What's the turnout hitherto been in the mayoral elections?
I'm not sure. Nathan, Charlotte, do you know the answers to that question?
I missed the second bit. Can you just repeat the turnout in?
The electoral turnout in these mayoral elections hitherto been
Very low.
so far.
Yeah, in West Yorkshire we haven't had, so there isn't a precedent, but yeah, I think in just looking at the local elections, we've got some of the lowest turnout in the country, I think, but I could be, but in answer, I don't know.
Yeah, they're very, very low. I mean, London tends to be an exception with a bit of this because, of course, they happen on the same day as Assembly elections, and that helps boost up. Not that they're the greatest of turnouts either, but it suffers. It's not a PCC election standalone, which is the lowest figure you'll ever get, which tends to clock in at like between 10 and 14% or somewhere around there. But normally, you know, I have a thing of, you get over 50% turnout in an election, it's a pretty major election these days. Turnout does dip and dip and dip, and that's the only trend that's been there, with probably a couple of exceptions, but I think they're outliers rather than trend.
Which is another sign that people are dissatisfied with, you know, the state of our democracy, sadly. So last question of the night, we'll come to Vicky's question, which she put in the chat. She makes the very good point that Labour has an assembly, but no other mayor has any kind of body. Which
London has an assembly.
I'm sorry?
London has an assembly.
Yes, exactly.
Not Labour, London.
Yes, sorry, London has an assembly, but none of the other mayors do. And that obviously, you know, the assembly to some degree holds the mayor, in this case Sadiq, to account. Although, as we know, the assembly itself is imperfect, really, as a body, because it has no actual power other than to provide some scrutiny of the mayor's decisions. But the mayor needs to take no interest in what they say. And I think there were lots of occasions, certainly when Boris was mayor, that the assembly would be saying X, Y, and Z, and Boris would either not turn up to listen to it, or would turn up to listen to it, you know, make some off the hand, you know, supposedly amusing comment, and then wander off, which didn't work particularly well. So I guess the question for you, Charlotte and Nathan, is, I mean, does the London Assembly need attention, or does it need to not exist anymore? Or, I mean, do you agree with Vicky that there is democratic deficit and that the other mayors should have bodies to hold them to account, which of course will bring in a whole other level of governance, you know, lots more politicians, lots more expense? Is that something the public wants? Over to you.
I mean, I'll definitely pick up on the latter point of that, which is where my experience, you know, do the public want that? I think the second you ask the public if they want more politicians, regardless of what level you put them in, they tell you no. I think there would probably be more of a mindset to scrap district authorities and just have unitary authorities everywhere than there would be to put in another layer. Not that that's necessarily actually the way to counteract a democratic deficit? Of course it isn't. I mean, I do think that there is scope for assemblies still. I don't think it's been thoroughly explored as to a way to handle that power imbalance. The bit for me, and I think what I get frustrated at, and I think, you know, as I say, I'm an East Midlander, we often moan about being the most bypass region in the world. I think we'll get electrification when everybody else is running on something else for our train line, let alone anything else. But is that actually, I just want some consistency. You know, I think this unwarranted variation across everything of the local government tiers is just unhelpful. Now, that could look like an assembly, that could look like a different directly accountable scrutiny body whose only job is to scrutiny. It could be chairs of the, or leaders of the other councils within there. I don't know what the right answer is. I do think Mike's right about the way you go about it is when Labour's in government, it does need to have a full-on talk with the country really about the social contract and our duties we owe to each other as citizens and how that interlays with the state and the state interlays back over to us. The bit I'd call for is just consistency across the piece personally.
Great, that's a very good point. Charlotte, final thoughts on the evening from you.
Just to add very quickly, I'd agree with a lot of that. I don't know enough about the assemblies and the way that they kind of work, but my instinct would be, you know, like I think with a lot of these, and especially a new mayoral role like in West Yorkshire, it's not going to be that you come in and kind of take charge. You know, there are a lot of there's local councils, there's bodies, there's things that exist already that need to be kind of implemented somehow in. So I guess, yeah, my instinct would just be to be pragmatic about what exists already rather than kind of coming in and saying, well, this is going to be a new way of things working, which might, as we know with all this kind of stuff, it might work in theory on paper, but it's all about how it actually works in practice. So yeah, I totally agree about the consistency. I think it's crying out for, and this is with like the whole of devolution, it's crying out for consistency across the country. It can't just be, you know, one thing works one place, or Manchester, they've got it great, let's replicate that, but that might not work elsewhere. But I think it's about all the regions, and come back to the last point, the more Labour mayors there are, the better, because it's about all these regions working and pulling together rather than it just being about, you know, party politics and with a national split ruling the day with the government trying to, you know, shed their accountability. So yeah, consistency, definitely.
So Vicky adds, what should Labour candidates be saying about this, you know, about the accountability issue in this campaign?
Yeah. So one thing Tracy has actually been saying, and this is from quite early on, is she's been talking with local councillors about, I guess it's a kind of form of this, is about having like backbench council committees. So a way of like using all of your resources as your councillors and people that are currently there. And I guess in West Yorkshire, we're spread across quite a massive geographical region. So there's really urban parts, there's really rural parts. So using, how can you have like little satellite people through the councils, and they can then do their own work to feed into something of like a backbench committee. So that's something that Tracy was talking about as a candidate that we're definitely going to explore, I think, going forward, and how that could be formalised and evolved.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, that, in a way, that would be an obvious way forward to, if in the absence of an assembly, to establish a system, even if it's you know, by the choice of the mayor or the councils, or something that's a little bit, you know, informal, where the mayor is held to account by the council leaders, by all the councillors in a region, by, you know, a selection, you know, of councillors in the region. So obviously there'll be loads of councillors elected in Andy Burnham's region, for example. And Nathan.
Yeah. So the only bit I'd add to that is for me that this is too important to be left to the candidates, actually. That this is the kind of thing that the party needs a national policy position on, because again, you know, otherwise you'll just see, you know, Tracy will come up with a great way and that'll work locally, but actually you'll just have unwarranted variation in another area and another area. And so all you do is double down and embed those inconsistencies. Whereas if the party says, actually, look, this is what we expect to be implemented across the regions where we're in, this gives some consistency. Also, that then forces the government to tackle it, you know, because if all of a sudden Labour go and win West Midlands, West Yorkshire, Manchester, Liverpool, and start putting on their own added levels of scrutiny, saying this is the standard, this is what the expectation is, that's going to put pressure on the government to make that happen. Because you've all of a sudden, you know, and that, when do the Tories make change? When we're in opposition, when local councils and Labour in those areas do things and put our values into practice anyway. Because then the Tories and the government haven't got a choice. They have to adapt to it because that's the reality on the ground. But that can only come from the centre. That has to come from the centre. And of course, you know, Tracy and Andy and everybody else should be feeding into that because they've got to embed it and it's got to work for their communities as well. But it's got to be up to the centre to help make that happen.
I wouldn't be at all surprised, actually, if in a region, you know, for example, Greater Manchester, where there's a Labour mayor, that Tory councillors and Tory councils would want the opportunity to hold, you know, that mayor to account, and vice versa in regions where there's a Tory mayor. So I think this is something that could, at a local level, win bipartisan support. You know, hopefully with national Labour support, even if the National Conservatives wouldn't be interested in implementing it.